Good morning, students. Today we are going to discuss another literary term, and that is paradox. Now, what is a paradox? It is a figure of speech that seems to contradict itself, but which, upon further examination, contains some truth or reason. What does it mean that a figure of speech that seems to contradict itself on the surface level? There seems some opposition, some contradiction. But when we examine it further, we found some truth and reason. Oscar Wilde's famous declaration that life is much too important to be taken seriously is a paradoxical statement. Life is much too important to be taken seriously. So we can say that a paradox is a statement which seems on its face to be self contradictory or absurd or without any meaning. But when we look it deeper, there's almost some meaning in it. So all poets have used paradoxes in their poems. And most importantly, this term was used in metaphysical poets. For example, John Donne, Andrew Marvell. These metaphysical poets have used this term very effectively. And Donne has used this device, this figure of speech, in its religious poem as well as in secular poems. There is a famous poem of John Donne, Death Be Not Proud of. So, in the concluding lines of that poem, John Donne writes, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. So, here the poet is using a biblical reference. A thing he is supported by the biblical reference means the things which are quoted in the Bible. What it does mean that it is a Christian belief that on the day of judgment, day of judgment means the final day, the day of Pirle, you can say, death itself would die by the command of God, and all human beings would be resurrected from their graves. And death would die by the command of God, by the order of God, and all dead persons would be resurrected from their grave, would come alive from their graves. In this way, human beings would live eternally after death. So, there is a paradox in this line that death would die and human beings would become alive. So, paradox is a central concern in modern poetry, and the new critics have used it very effectively. Not only the rhetoric, but they have encompassed other things also in it. And we can quote, they have used it for surprising deviation. The new critics have used this term for surprising deviation from common opinions. For example, the Cleanbrook, the new critic, writes in his famous book, The Well-Wrought Urn, the famous book of Cleanbrook. He writes that language of poetry is the language of paradox. It is a very authoritative statement that modern poetry is full of paradoxes. So, not only the metaphysical age, this device was famous, was very liked one by the poets, but in modern poetry it is also used very frequently. So there are other examples of paradoxes which you come across in your daily life, and they are: the pen is mightier than the sword. The pen is mightier than the sword. That what can you do with a pen, you cannot do with a sword. Similarly, The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a very common example. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And impossible is not a word in my vocabulary. So these are very common examples of paradoxes because these statements are full of paradoxes. I think when we read poems and when we come across such kind of ideas, so you can underline it for your references. I hope that you have got this term paradox. Thank you.